Hello, everyone. Welcome to the next installation of the Goose webinar series. Today, we'll have Colonel Soenke Marahrens from the German military talking about the Prussian Kriegsspiel. As a reminder, you will have to put your questions in the chat for us to moderate them. We'll take questions throughout the presentation. So I hand it over to Soenke for his introduction for himself and to kick off his presentation. Thank you, everyone.
Hi, everyone. My name is Soenke Marahrens, and Sebastian, thank you very much for introducing me. In my normal life, I'm a colonel in the German Air Force, and at the moment I'm stationed at Helsinki. I just arrived last night. And I will be the next director for strategy and defense at the European Center for Countering Hybrid Threats here in Helsinki. And what I will present to you came from the chance 5 years ago. I had the opportunity to join a master's program at the German Führungsakademie, our General Staff College. And there I met a professor from the University of Würzburg, and he gave me a chance to write a master thesis on the Prussian Kriegsspiel. This is how a Air Force officer comes to love and to like the Prussian Kriegsspiel. What I will present to you is an overview. What is the Prussian Kriegsspiel all about? I will talk about a little bit about the main actors, so the ones who wrote those games and what were the intents. And at the end, I will present you some of my findings I had during playing the Kriegsspiel, as well as doing a lot of research in old German military newspapers of the 19th century. So at the moment, I've got the problem to bring my, hope I get my presentation to the next slide. Yeah, okay, here it goes. So almost everything started with the father of von Reiswitz. And you can see on this picture, the table of his Kriegsspiel, but that's not the one we know today as a Prussian Kriegsspiel. It has almost has most of the features, but it's missing two features from what the son later on added. The first thing, it has no dice. Also, you see some dice on the left side in the picture. Someone has added them later on, and von Reiswitz Senior's game had only a artificial map scale, for example, like in the modern game Settlers. So they were able to change the map for every game with certain features, like you can see on the small picture on the right side. But the son added two things, and they were the dice, and I will talk in depth about the dice of the Kriegsspiel, and as well as the map von Reiswitz Jr. added to everything. So the protagonists, and when I started my master thesis, I had only the task to talk about Wilhelm von Tschischwitz, the first lieutenant in the Prussian army, who added a Kriegsspiel edition in 1862, and who did 3 updates after in 67, 70, and 74. But as I already said, the father started. He's not the first one. There are others like von Hellwig and others, but our Kriegsspiel is directly derived from the son, and this is the most important one from the Kriegsspiel, because he made it happen, Georg Heinrich Rudolf Johann von Reiswitz. And he presented his game, which he played with his colleagues and comrades at his brigade in Berlin, and also with one of the brothers of the king. And the brother of the king gave him the chance to present his game to the Chott, General von Müffling. And von Reiswitz was able to convince von Müffling that his idea is a great idea. And I think almost every one of you who has ever looked into something has read this great citation: "This is not a game, this is a school for war," or "this is teaching for war." This came from this event, because at the beginning, when Müffling was tasked by the brother of the king to join a meeting with a first lieutenant and a couple of second lieutenants, he was not so amused. But Reiswitz made a great move. He made von Müffling the leader of the game, because he asked him to set a situation, and two of his generals, supported by the first lieutenant, had to play the game. And von Müffling immediately saw the potential of it and dived into the game. And from our perspective, from the historic perspective, you could see this is the birth hour of the Prussian Kriegsspiel. After this game, Müffling decided that every regiment in the Prussian army should have one, and the king presented one to every regiment, the Prussian Kriegsspiel. And this is also one of the interesting findings. There was never in history, in the Prussian history, an army office providing the Kriegsspiel or providing new rule sets or changes or everything. It was always done by individuals or by societies and associations, but never officially run by the Prussian army. So numbers 3 are Karl von Decker and Ferdinand von Witzleben. They took on the task in the winter of 1826 and 27 to set up a committee to check the game. Sorry, Robert, I can't answer this this question. It's something I have to look up. I have no clue. The only thing I knew is that von Reiswitz, together with his colleagues, had to hire a tool maker and other people, and they produced the games on their own after the king ordered to present it to the whole army. But I cannot tell you how many sets were made at that time. The only thing I found was 10 years later, 1835, that the Prussian army asked companies to provide them an estimate how much a new Kriegsspiel set would cost. I found something about this in a Prussian military time. So von Decker and Witzleben used 1827 and 28 the time to recheck the game, to look into rules, whether the rules were congruent, whether they were fitting, whether there were some problems in there. And out of their work, and they studied the infantry, the artillery, and the behavior of the cavalry, of the rule sets, and so on. They came up with a so-called supplement. And this is an add-on to the von Reiswitz Spiel of 1824. Then the rules were spread, and you still can get the original rules on Google Books. But in 1846, 1855, the Berlin Kriegsspiel Association published a new set of rules. They took some parts out of it, out of the original ones. They changed parts of it, especially adopted new technology, for example, range for the artillery and the new rifles, and added this to the rule set. The rule set of 1846 and 1855 are almost identical. The 55 has only some small corrections of words being written in the wrong way and so on. Then there must be a so-called Weigelt rule set from 1848. We know this from Tschischwitz, because he's referring in his first edition to the Weigelt set, but so far we couldn't find them. So it looks like that they were written by him, but they were never officially published, and we haven't found an archive which still has this Weigelt set. But from my research, I can say, because von Tschischwitz is directly edited from has directly edited the Berlin Kriegsspiel Association rules, I couldn't see something coming from the side what Weigel had at that time. Parallel to Tschischwitz, who started in 1862, in 1870, Thilo von Trotter, at that time a retired colonel, provided the rule set, and whereas Tschischwitz came from, Thilo von Trotter was an infantry officer, and his position was with regards to the Kriegsspiel rules that he didn't see the success of the infantry in the rifles. He still saw them in the sword. So he added some rules which provided what we call the short arm, the Kurzwaffe, which is, or the sidearm, which at that time was the sword, as the weapons. And there's a nice discussion between von Tschischwitz and von Trotter between 1870 and 1874 in the German military papers, where you always can see that when the other filed a new edition, the first one was always complaining about the rule sets. Jakob Meckel is a lieutenant, and he's a teacher at Kriegsakademie in Hanover. And he has some problem with the rule sets, especially for his task of teaching young officers. So he wrote a study in 1873 and said there must be some stuff must be adopted, and some things must be seen totally different. And this discussion, which Meckel started in 1873, later on led to the, you could also say, almost call it a schisma of the division between so-called rigid and the free wargaming. The rigid wargaming is the dice-based wargame. The free wargame is the wargame without dice. Personally, I believe that the rigid wargame is much more freer than the so-called free wargame, because now you're exchanging the randomness of the dices against the personal preferences of the one who is leading the game. And there's also some history resources showing that this really caused some problems, because the people were suddenly not playing the game any longer, or not doing the Kriegsspiel, it's not playing, but they were just adhering to their superior officer or to the one who ran the game. Verdi de Vinois, in 1875, a colonel, in 1876, a brigadier general, becomes later on the Prussian Secretary of War. He says, I don't need any dices at all, because if I have a maneuver, there are no dices. I will define who will win and who will lose. And this is when the division started of the free and the rigid wargaming. From my research, I cannot say what I saw in the conventional literature, that this was one step. Okay, now we are leaving the dices out. This was a process over 5 to 6 years. And personally, and my professor said, he can't deny this, but he doesn't believe it. Personally, I believe it. It just came from the fact that he has the higher rank than from Tschischwitz at that time. Because in 1878 and 1801, another young lieutenant published another dice-based rule set, Lieutenant von Neumann. And therefore you could see that those games were played parallel, sometimes with dices and sometimes without dices. So the application, and this is what I find quite interesting, because sometimes I had the feeling when I did my historic research that it was not clear the purpose of the game. So Reiswitz, Decker, Tschischwitz, and Trotter had a peer-to-peer training of people meeting in an officers' club. This was an officers' game only, and playing the Kriegsspiel. Meckel, on the other hand, like I said before, he did beginners education and training, whereas Verdi de Vinois used it for control, for example, of the capabilities of his battalion commanders. You could also use them to experiment with new capabilities. For example, the telegraph was implemented in 1870, and we have the evidence from a brigadier commander, and I think it was Decker, who said, because there was no war around 1830 until 1850s, that he as a brigade commander had never had a chance to fire live rounds. So he used the Kriegsspiel to experiment his new capabilities when his guns changed by a technical change. Of course, you can use it for validation of plans. And there is a but in it. I will come when I talk about the don't. You can use it for understanding history in order to find out what happened in a certain historic situation. And from what I have seen with regards to playing the game myself and with young students, civilian as well as military, you can use it very well for coaching of leaders, because the immersion after 30 to 40 minutes, people cannot hide, and they will stand at the table, they will take decisions, they will step back from decisions. And if you are in a coachy trainee situation, there as a coach, you have a chance to see the real mentee you are coaching at that time, because he can't hide. And there's historical evidence which prove my case, because there were criticisms saying that some people were hiding at the table, but if you would meet them at the bar, they would be the greatest heroes. The only thing you should not do is to try to change history afterwards. And this goes back to a story von Reiswitz had. Reiswitz was asked in 1825, 1826 to come to St. Petersburg in Russia, because the Prussian king has presented one game to the Russian Tsar. And now the Russian Tsar was looking for an officer who could explain it, who could run the game for him. So it was a call at night, and the next morning they already left to Russia. And in St. Petersburg, Reiswitz was asked by other officers to replay a certain battle, certain Prussian battle. So they set up everything, and but they didn't use the original plan. They used another plan which was provided by Scharnhorst, but at that time was denied by the general who ran at that time the campaign. And suddenly you could see that the Scharnhorst plan was much better than what really happened at that day. And at that moment, a general entered the room, and the general was part of the campaign leading team. And he saw what was happening on the map, and he saw that they used the other plan. And he was the mentor for Reiswitz. And at that moment, they freezed their relationship. And Reiswitz was never able to heal this, because the general saw this as a dishonorable act. And therefore, later on, this goes still until 1876. I found something in sources where when other nations were asking what to do with the game, they always asked, never try to re-win the war. It's impossible, and it always will only cause some problems. I can see it. I knew they used it for training, especially Moltke used it. And he gave his officers tasks to solve. And he also wrote a booklet of, I think, 55 or 56 tasks. And from my knowledge, I knew that they used, before Moltke started his staff rights, so bringing the officers in those regions where they would fight, that they also used the Kriegsspiel to fight in these areas, because this is one of the two things I mentioned in the beginning, that for the first time they used the map, because until 1824 the map came over, or map making and mapping Prussia came over from France, from Napoleon, and therefore there's a nice there's a couple of citations where they say at least they learned to read a map, because at a certain point in time this is an art if you don't understand what's going on the map. And if you have never been confronted with a map, and you have this on your horse for the first time, it was better to understand what's going on the map, what are the heights, the lows, and so on. And this was also seen as an extra advantage, teaching people to read a map in the military. So a Kriegsspiel, so far, if you want to play it, you need you could play it on one master map, but then you need dividers, so not everyone has full oversight, because that's the main difference between the Kriegsspiel and chess. Chess itself has clear rules. It's a game of mind, your mind against my mind. Kriegsspiel has the dice in the middle. It's played on a map, and the original Kriegsspiel map is a 1 to 8,000 map. And the reason for the 1 to 8,000, because the so-called Prussian General Staff map was 1 to 10,000, was that Reiswitz had access to those maps, which came from map making. 1 to 8,000 is the size you're using when you're running around somewhere in the field and measuring. And from this, you create 1 to 8,000. And later on, map makers would use them as the basic material to create the 1 to 10,000 map. And on the right side, you have the so-called tokens or peons, like the Prussians called them, setting up a game. And I found a full set, and I calculated it with a money exchange rate from the Deutsche Bundesbank. And I was astonished when I saw it. So a full Kriegsspiel set in 1870 for a Wargaming association had the value of $2,500 of today. So it was not easy to have one and to maintain it. So when, for example, Meckel showed up in 1873 and saying 1875, so we have to change from 1 to 8,000 to 1 to 25,000, a lot of associations said, no, this is too expensive, we can't afford it, and we're losing all our materials. So the sequence of events in a Kriegsspiel is as follows. You have the initial situation, which is given by the leader of the game. This could be 48 hours in advance. So the two team leaders, blue and red, were given the initial situation, and they had to file their initial order. And these orders were read on the night when they played the game. And the conduct of the game was in so-called moves. Every move equaled 2 minutes in real time. And the way of setting, and this is old German, is you're moving first, then you decide about the attacks, then you will find out about the losses. The losses will be noted, and then maybe some tokens will be taken away from the map. And most important, the leader of the game is a dictator. There is no complaining at the table. If you have a problem, you can bring it at the end, but not during the game. All his decisions are finally. And this is also part of the discussion between the rigid and the free war game, because the rigid wargaming, by using dice, also protected especially younger ranks. For example, if you have a first lieutenant who leads a game against older captains or majors who would tell them, you know, in reality, we would do this totally different. I would have won this battle or this fight and so on. But now he could stick to the dice and saying, no, sir, the dice were against you. The battle came out another way. And also most important feature, and this for me is the strict division from a normal game, is you have to debrief a Kriegsspiel at the end. And by this, the leader of the game is summing up what has happened. Like in DoD or in other games, he becomes a storyteller, telling what has happened and not saying, you know, here the dice were against you. No, in this situation, also your artillery battery where on the height, the Prussian infantry was able to break through and cut you, and you lost the battle at that mountain and so on. This led to this situation and so on. So Prussian Kriegsspiel always needs the debriefing. Otherwise, it's a game. So just to give you a small overview, on the right side, you see the amount of tokens you need only for one army if you would have bought a full game at that time. And battalion from the infantry would equal 800 men. In between, it became 1,000. Then they went back to 800. An escadron of the cavalry would be 150 horses, and batteries, artillery batteries at the beginning were 4, later 6 guns per battery. So a setup, and this is an original example from a Prussian magazine of that time. And yes, you could see the first 2 dots are for blue, and the second, the third and the fourth part are for the enemy, the other one. And here you would they would play West Corps of Prussia and East versus East Corps of Prussia. And this is also an interesting fact, and we could not prove it so far. Kriegsspiel is a symmetric game. Even when it was translated to other languages, it was always that both sides had the same weapons, the same artillery guns with the same capabilities. So even when they knew from reality, for example, starting 1855, that the Austrians had the better rifles, the Kriegsspiel was never adapted, was never made asymmetric. So for the movements, on the right side, you see the original ruler, which they used to measure. So, and every measurement you see is the 2 minutes movement. Until 1870, they used the Prussian pace. And after 1817, in Prussia, the meter was introduced. And then they changed to the meter. A Prussian pace at that time would be 0.75 meters or 75 centimeters. And during the period from 1824 to 1874, there were permanent adaptation of the ranges for artillery rifles in accordance with the state of the art of the technology at that time. And the movements, and this is something you can see in the middle field, they were quite complex because, for example, the cavalry could trot, they could walk and trot, and if they would do gallop over a certain period of time, they were not entitled to do it for a certain period of time afterwards, and so on. And all those rules must be inserted by the leader of the game in order to maintain situational awareness and in order to bring the game forward. So initial orders, and this is very easy. It's on the left. No communication on the blue or on the red team allowed after initial. Am I back?
Yeah, we just lost you for a quick second.
Okay, so on the left side, you see the initial order. On the right side, if you do the game, you have to fill this piece of paper and giving orders to your units. And the Prussian Kriegsspiel has a certain rule, which we are not using today, but which was very strict at that time, that leaders, for example, if you would have a senior leader and one leader for cavalry, artillery, and the infantry, they were not entitled to talk to each other. So the leader of the blue team had to write down his orders, and then the leader of the game at the main map had to calculate how long it would take to send this order from the leader to, for example, to the leader of the infantry. And all communications must be done via the leaders team on both sides. And there you could also see, and this is what about the leadership training, and also for me, it also goes into mission command. The Kriegsspiel is the game of decision making, and you were on your own. You couldn't ask someone else if you are the leader of the cavalry, but everyone could see whether you were doing, whether we are taking the right decisions or whether you would take the not so likable decisions at that time. And this comes from the idea that all communications has to run via the leader team. So starting values in order to count and to calculate the losses for a platoon were 48 points. Yeah, Alan, you're totally right. Could even take 15 minutes, 20 minutes. So in the beginning, if you would send out someone, I don't know the English word, on a horse to report to a lower leader, he has 900 paces per 2 minutes. So it was faster, but even then, if you would be 4 kilometers away from each other, it would be 5 kilometers, and then he has to report back. So by this, you could see it could be 10 to 15 minutes on the game table until the leader would see that his orders were taken in account. On the other hand, this offers extra immersion for more players, because now you have to act on your own. Now you can't wait, because everyone sees if you're not moving, nothing happened. So for the losses, a cavalry unit and a company. Both teams had to do their own movements on their map, and they were just informed by the leader. For example, if a unit from them would see a unit of the enemy, and for this a measurement of 3,000 paces or 2,400 meters were given in the rules. And the moment when the fight started, the adjudication was done by the leaders. And by this, they had to accept the results coming from the leaders. So, and von Reiswitz, for me, greatest invention is his dice, and I can almost call it a weapon system. Because what you see here is one side of a dice. Reiswitz himself had 5 dices, and dice 1 and 2 were for the infantry, for using when the infantry used gun, in Germany the Büchse or a rifle, and dice 3 and 5 for artillery damage when the and they differed. When the artillery had a better position, they would choose dice 3. If they had a worse position, they would use dice number 5. And by this, the first throw was about who will win or who will lose the battle. And for this, you could see on the upper left side the black background below the D. For this, they used all the 5 dices, but they had to choose the dice in accordance to the force ratio. For example, dice number 1 was 1 to 1. Dice number 2 was 2.3 to, I think, 1.3, and so on. So the leader of the game had to choose for the first time the right dice in order to find to decide the battle. And then in a second throw, he had to dice for the losses. And for this, he put the matrix on the dice, like you can see on the in the middle. So on the left side, infantry Damage at 100 step would be 30, 20, 10, and 4, and so on. So it made it easier for them to control the game because they didn't have to go back to a sheet. They could see it immediately, what would be the dice. On dice number 1, you see the red circle. The circle was for if the artillery would fire into a village, whether to find out whether a house was burning or not burning, or whether the burning of houses would stop, and so on. So everything was added. And you could also see the 25 and the 30 in the middle for fighting on the battlefield. And in order to prevent a situation you might know from if you play the game of Risk, when two parties kick into each other and you have 13 armies from blue and maybe 15 from yellow, and they are fighting until blue gets yellow off the table. In order to prevent this, Reiswitz had the idea of retreat, defeat, and total defeat. And by this, for example, when two cavalry units crashed into each other, the total defeat would also mean that they could not re-attack for example, for 15 moves. Or if they were defeated, it was only for 10 moves, or they had to retreat in order to prevent that they would mix on the battlefield and would stay there. And this also makes the game a little bit more, takes it away from being just a game of ratio like you could see it in Risk. So the first row, who will win in accordance to the ratio, and you can see the ratio on the lower right side from the original from Reiswitz. But you could also put this in a sheet, and then you could use normal dice of today's, because later on they used the normal dice. And defining the ratio, that's the art of the leader of the game. And here you can see you must be well aware of all those rules between page 10 and 20 to define the right ratio at a certain spot. And for this is also part of the historic teaching. People who were able to run a game, to lead a game, was well searched after. And a lot of people said, no, I don't want to do this task. Interesting, especially from a training perspective, if you would be, in the Italian army, in order to become a captain, you must lead successful in a blue or a team battle. In order to become a major, you must prove that you were able to lead successful a whole Kriegsspiel. I don't know about any objective criteria in the German staff and general staff officers like this one. So in 1828, when the so-called supplement of von Reiswitz Kriegsspiel showed up, the team added something because they had strong discussion about this, about heroism on the battlefield. What is about this young platoon leader of the cavalry who takes up his men and his horses up the hill, and he's able to strike an overwhelming battle, artillery battery? And for this, they asked for the so-called emergency or exception throw, and they created a new system for this. They added a dice number 6 with a ratio 1:5, and you had to throw this dice number 6. And if you are on the winning side, you are the 1. Then you were allowed to take the so-called Schimmel dice, and you can see them on the right side. I found this picture on the internet. The Schimmel game was a bar game at that time, and the dice had only numbers on one side. And they took away, don't ask me why, I think it came out for the ratio at a certain point in time. They took out dice number 2, so it was 1, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and you had to throw with those dice. And if the result on the table would be higher than 7, your emergency or exception throw would be successful. And by this young platoon leader was able to conquer the enemy. However, If you were successful, both units were taken from the map. If you were unsuccessful, it was only the platoon, but if it was successful, also the platoon. By this, they wanted to maintain the order of the game and the order of the battle, so that not every platoon leader suddenly become a hero, a Rommel on his own, in order to prevent this situation. But they wanted to create a situation where you can use this emergency or exception throw if you are willing to take that risk. But the risk would always part of it would be that you will use your unit. So, and then from Tschischwitz, in his tables, and on the right side you see the 1862 table. Sorry, it's the 1872 table, and there you can see the ratio. On the left side is blue, on the high side is red, and by this, so for example, you have 6 units red, 6 units blue. You have to choose dice number 1. And there's also the exception rule is you have to dice with dice number 6, and then you have to re-dice in with the dice you can see now 4 or 3 if you have a ratio of 5 to 10 or 7 to 11 and so on. But therefore you always have to do first a throw with the 1 to 5 dice number 6. So this idea of exception, it vanished in between, but it came back later on. So heroism on the battlefield is also part of the game. And from this, after it was decided who won a certain battle, now it was about calculating the conditions and the losses. And for the losses you see on the right side, this is for the artillery. There's also one for rifles, a table. And what you can see is with a certain dice throw, for example, a 1, if you take the upper, you would lose 11 points. On a range below 280, if it would be beyond 200, you would only lose 5 points. And by this, doing this for all the weapons and the rifles, they created the losses. And the losses were calculated for the attacker, and the defender would take half the losses of the attacker. And like I said before, the wedging was prevented by adding to retreat and total retreat to prevent that the units were wedging together. And by this, you can see if you have a full-blown battle, leading a game is a hell of a work, and running it. And then to maintain the 2 minutes, so far, when I've seen the game, we were just able to maintain the 2 minutes, but in a 10 minutes period. To calculate everything, to set up everything, to write the adjudication back to the teams, telling them whether they have lost and how they have lost, or reports and so on. Really to run the game in real time, if you are not a well-trained, it's almost impossible. I tried it 2 times, and within 2 hours, I was able to do 10 moves. So from there, you're playing the game on the map like it's depicted. On the player side, you have to maintain your own situational awareness. And this is quite interesting. We did a couple of tests with this. We are photographing this. Now you could see that it takes a lot of time to maintain this situational picture, also for the gamers. And this adds more complexity to what's going on in the game. You have to calculate the movements. The empires are almighty. Don't fight the setting. And you will see this immediately, that in a certain situation, someone is complaining. And therefore, being an empire is a lot of work. And of course, enjoy the game. It's great immersion. And by this, be careful, don't lose friends. This is what I love when I see Sebastian talking about his games on the weekends and so on. He's never reporting whether friends became enemies in real world afterwards. And the most important thing, and this is already in von Reiswitz's paper, this game is not about winning, it's all about decision making. And by this, you could be the winner of the night if the leader decides, yes, in this situation, the gods of war were against you, but you recognize the situation. You recognize the situation, you saw you were not able to win a certain battle, and you retreated at a certain point and time, and this was the correct decision to take in this situation. And therefore, it's not about winning, but the winning as part of the serious gaming idea of maintaining the immersion and also the motivation. So don't underestimate it. I think if you're losing it every night, you might be at a certain time, you might choose another hobby. So, and then, like I said, at the end, the leader of the game, my research is available to the public. Unfortunately, it's only so far in German. And I try to publish it via the German the German Armed Forces Historic Division, but at the moment I don't have an English version for that. But if you're interested, you can send Sebastian an email, and I can send you my paper, and maybe have a chance to do some of the stuff with Google Maps. So at the end, the leader has to tell the story of the night. You know, what has happened on the battlefield. Where were losses, where were winning situations, where were the gods of war for you, where were them against you. So what I saw when I looked into the different versions from 1824 up until 1874, you still could find fragments in the 1874 rule set, which were originally from Reiswitz in 1824. And I was able to identify 4 different reasons for changes. This was number 1 was correcting an existing rule. A lot of people playing the Kriegsspiel even privately, because you could buy them via bookshops in Berlin. They sent back letters to the publisher, to the editor, and saying, "Hey, we used these rules. This never came out the right way. From our point of view, you have to change something." And this was normally corrected, especially if it's from Tschischwitz, in the next edition. Then, of course, we could see rule adjustments for technical or tactical purposes. We could see rule nexus, readjustment of 2 or more rules to prevent inconsistencies. I know someone was reporting if you would apply rule A and then you had to apply rule B, that never came out the right way, and therefore they changed rules to prevent this. And sometimes we saw remodeling, the increase or the decrease of the game resolution. For example, by changing the ranges, or by implementing new rules. Some people try to play against the game. Yep. Robert, all this was done via the so-called Prussian military. It was done by books as well as the Prussian military newspaper, and this Prussian military newspaper was open to the public. So if you were interested at that time, you could ask for an edition. It came out 2 times a week, was published in Berlin, also in the Frankfurt area, and there was also one in, I think, in Austria from the same publisher, publishing Austrian themes. And there you could find Kriegsspiel articles and also letters to the publishers. So findings in a lot of modern work, you will see that people saying Reiswitz worked on the in order to calculate the losses together with Scharnhorst. But in my work, I found out this was a translation error, because the original says he used Scharnhorst and his own experience being part of the Prussian artillery committee. But Scharnhorst was part of the committee until 1813, and Reiswitz joined the artillery committee in 1819. But Reiswitz used the book Scharnhorst has published because Scharnhorst was the first one who went to the firing range and who looked into how good Prussian units were firing. And they used clothes and let 10, 15, 50 soldiers firing, and then they added a stress factor and so on. And this work was used by Reiswitz as the basic numbers for his tables. So my theory, and this is something I already talked about it, to throw dice or not to throw dice, the difference between the change from the rigid to the free war game is, for me, only came from the higher rank of Verdi de Vinoir. And from my point of view, rigid is more free than free war gaming, because then it's still a game by chance versus arbitrariness, despotism, or capriciousness of the leader. And the development of the free war game was rather by laziness instead of necessity, and laziness caused by the huge amount of work. If you would use, you have to dice 2 times, you have to calculate, you have to find out the right marker in the on the sheets for the losses and so on. So that's my theory of why rigid wargaming became free wargaming. Like I said before, Kriegsspiel were always symmetric. So far, we saw translations into English in 1872 because the RUSI, the British Society of the Royal Society, bought 2 games via the British military attaché in Berlin, and Bancroft translated the Trotter game and Baring translated the Tschischwitz game. So far, we could recognize a Kriegsspiel in Austria and Italy, in Sweden, Netherlands, in Russia. So if you send an email to Sebastian or me, I can send you my master thesis. So, and from publications in a newspaper, we could also find that the game was sent to the United States, to India, Brazil, as well as Japan. Like I said before, it was never officially published or updated by the Prussian Army Office. Being a good leader was and still is a challenge, and I think Sebastian will agree on that. And most important, Kriegsspiel is not about winning, it's all about decision making, and it teaches learning by losing. In order to understand the development, I went into the rule sets, and on the left side you can see in green fragments of original Reiswitz in the Berlin Wargame Association rules, because they're still in green. And to be fair, I had to compare them word by word. And when Tschischwitz took over in 1862, he took everything out of the rule sets which was for explanation. Matthias, können wir gerne machen. And there you can see he reduced. Okay. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Okay. All right. So, and there you can see he cutted the rules from more than 100 paragraphs, and sometimes the paragraphs were more than 1 page, down to 60. And mainly by cutting out everything he said a Prussian officer or a normal officer at that time must know. For example, there were rules describing how what kind of formation were available, marching formations, cavalry attack formations, and so on. And he said, "This is knowledge to the officer. I don't need this in the rules, And by this, he cut it down to 63 paragraphs and made it much more gamier or more usable. And by this, you could see that he started a renaissance of the Prussian war game. And the result of this this renaissance of the war game in 1862 was that observers of the war of 1866 and 67, the so-called German war between Prussia and Austria, and the Prussian-French War of 1771, was that observers said the young officers were much more eager to take a decision, to take opportunities than their opponents on the other side. And for my other research, I did a lot of stuff on Auftragstaktik, mission command. I also published an English paper on that. Personally, I believe that the success of Auftragstaktik was also based on playing the Kriegsspiel, because now when you are a platoon leader, you're normally in the real world, you only see your 150 soldiers and their horses. Maybe in a regimental exercise, you see all battalions. But on the Kriegsspiel, acting in accordance with the directive of your superiors, in the Kriegsspiel, for the first time, you could see what your small token, what his role would be in a huge battle. And by this, the young officers had a clear understanding that they were fulfilling a task within a larger frame. And this is part of mission command, acting in accordance with the will and the understanding of the higher leader. And Kriegsspiel, if it's done in a peer-to-peer way, training, this will add to you this kind of understanding. And the added value for today, and this is why I still like it, and I'm in the process of making the German Führungsakademie, setting up a Kriegsspiel, because we are playing it during the study periods in the master's program, but it's not part of the normal curriculum. I see the added value in the immersion of serious game. On the one hand, you can create a lot of stress. On the other hand, you can see the happiness within the people. Kriegsspiel, it's an abstract form of war fighting, and you can teach it very fast because the players don't have to know the rules. The rules must only be known by the leaders, but it's still war. And one of the problems of modern warfare, and Sebastian, correct me if I'm wrong, is if you play, for example, an army game, suddenly the helicopter guy shows up and my helicopter would do this totally different, or my tank would be able to go through this mud and would never stuck there, and so on. And those discussions, and 150 years ago, they had the same discussions for infantry, cavalry, and so on. But today, if you take a young female or male soldier, they have a clear understanding, or have an understanding from movies like Napoleon, Battle of Waterloo, and so on, how they would fight, but not about the details, and they wouldn't find the setting, but it's still war fighting. It allows you to teach the essence of leadership, because you can see how someone acts at the table and how he's able to execute command and control, because it's still the idea of coordinating space, time, forces, and information, or through information. Of course, you have to learn plan, trading error versus fallacy. And like Moltke said, no plan will survive contact with the battlefield. On the other hand, showing up on the battlefield with no plan is suicide. And this teaches you flexibility and agility. But this also put extra pressure on the leader of the game. And this was Meckel's problem in 1873. You cannot control the output, because the output of the game is controlled by the dice. And therefore, you as a trainer using the war game, you must be more flexible. So you must have different sets of game. For example, starting, if you have young platoon leaders for the first time, you start with companies, then you go to the battalion level and so on, so that they can see how a march goes on and how to move and so on. But then everything is an open game. And then it's about decision making. You can experience the full OODA loop or the C2 cycle. This is also important because if you have a maneuver with forces in the field, you don't see normally the losses if you don't go to a special training center. And here you experience the losses, you see the success or the unsuccess of your plan. And by this, you have to start the second C2 cycle or the second OODA loop with the results, with real results from non-predictable results from the first OODA loop. And then, of course, you have a smart enemy. It's not like it's a dumb computer. Your enemy wants to win, you want to win. And therefore, this also adds motivation for all players to the table. And of course, you can use it from my point of view for selection, for leadership basic training and coaching, because there you can see how people react under stress. And talking about VUCA and other things about complexity, this game really teaches complexity, because you have to try, you have to find out what's right, you have to find maybe to correct your decisions. And by this, for me, it's a great tool to teach complexity. If you want to buy a Kriegsspiel, so far there is not one box available, and I think we have to talk to the game makers about this. At Command Post Games, you can buy the markers, dice, and the ruler. This from Reiswitz 1824, 1828. You can buy the rule set in English from Tschischwitz 1862 at Two Fat Laddies. That's a British company. There's a rule set in German, in modern German, written by Wintjes. These are the von Tschischwitz rules from 1867. And if you browse to Google Books and the internet, you can find the Trotter rules, the Reiswitz rule, the Berlin Kriegsspiel rule von Tschischwitz. You can find Totten, and Totten says in his word that he was inspired by a Bavarian officer who played the game in 1865. And you can use Bancroft or Baring. But I think it's Bancroft. They are not only translated, they are also adapted to the British conditions with regards to ranges of rifles and guns. So, and by this, and who will find my mistakes on the slide can keep them. This ends my presentation, and I'm ready to take any question, whatever you love.
Thank you for the great presentation. We're going to put some questions in the chat, so feel free, everyone, to toss in your questions into the chat, and I'll read them out loud in some kind of coherent matter. So one of the first questions I got is, it is debated that the Kriegsspiel was played and developed over the first periods of significant change in modern warfare, including the first generation war and the second generation war. So how quickly did the Prussian army recognize this shift, and how quickly was the game changed to reflect this change?
So what I've seen, it was played between 1824 and until 1835. But then with a lack of wars at that time, it was not played commonly. So we don't have, I haven't seen any reports that there was a monthly war game. It was accompanied by so-called Kriegsspiel associations. So officers could go to the officers club or to civilian clubs. And there's a report about the Berlin, one in Berlin, one in Neisse, one in Königsberg, which is East Prussia. And there was another association playing this game. And like I said, the compression and the decompression of the game rules took part over 20 years. But every time they changed the rules, they also adapted it to the real world situations, the technology of that time.
So to follow up on to that question is, you mentioned throughout your presentation that Kriegsspiel evolved through various authors and designers from the original design from Reiswitz. So what were some of the elements of change that and why were those games changed, either for playability or to change the dynamic in warfare?
Give me a chance. I hope I find it. So these were the 4 different types. Some were for correcting existing rules. For example, suddenly a rule showed up that cavalry was only allowed to cross in front of an artillery unit within 600 beyond 600 paces or 400 meters. And I've got the understanding from this that someone came up with a snake maneuver, you know, during the game, and so he was not taking the direct line to the artillery on the other side. He was snaking left and right, and by this the artillery was not able to find out in brackets where the enemy was. And of course, if you're on the battlefield and you see horses running, and at a certain point in time, the artillery will fire like hell, even maybe choose. And by this, there was a correcting of an existing rule, because the rule was misused. We call it, maybe there's some study, it's called the gamer mode, when you use game rules in order to win. It's a kind of cheating. So you're not behaving like you would behave in the real world. You're choosing a game rule in order to win. That's a gamer mode. And this is the first finding. The second finding was about technical, it's metagaming, that's fine. Of technical and tactical purposes. This was when something was changing, when something has changed in the rules. For example, when units were changed, the size of units were changed, or the ranges of especially of the artillery. And then at a certain point in time, you could see this between 1870, 1872. This was the end of the line warfare in Europe. And for me, this is also the end of the Kriegsspiel, because then they changed from the battalion size, the line was the battalion, down to the company size. And by this, normally you would have also to remodel the whole game. And this is what Tschischwitz tries in his 1874 rule set. But if you go through this, the game becomes too complex to run this, because then suddenly you have to dice whether you were allowed to go forward, to jump. Then you have to dice for the next jump. Then the other side has to throw a dice whether they could see the enemy, and so on. And this remodeling, and this is also one of my theory, that you could see this break of 1874 was when the resolution of the battlefield with could not be brought to the map. And then they had discussions, maybe we change the resolution, we call it the regimental game. We go to a resolution to 1 to 80,000. And this is also the birth hour of the so-called strategic war games, because they said on the lower scale, we cannot play this any longer. It takes too long, it's too much effort, and it's too many items, too many tokens on the game.
So on that note, were the rules for negative events such as accidental friendly fire ever included, or imperfect knowledge of the location of friendly forces included?
Nope, I haven't seen anything about friendly fire, because you only dice for attack and for winning and losing, and then for losses for the attacker, and the defender gets half of the losses. There was nothing on friendly fire. There were rules in the 1870-72 rules with regards to direct and indirect fire. So there was a little bit, there was a lucky event brought into the rules. So if you do indirect fire and you have an idea, and you were able to measure the battlefield, for example, during daylight, then you could hit someone with indirect fire, but nothing about friendly fire.
So on that note, how do you see Kriegsspiel providing insights into current modern day wargaming, either for education or analysis? You mentioned a couple interesting points. For instance, how the Kriegsspiel was used to explore the telegraph as a technology, but also how it was used in educational unit-based training.
Yeah, like I said, I would use it today. I've read an article that the US Marine Corps is using chess as a decision tool now for young soldiers. So they have to, if they go by, they have to take situational awareness and to make the next move on a couple of chess boards provided to a company. But like I said, I personally prefer the complexity and the unpredictable of the Kriegsspiel, even in modern times. And to be fair, if you're teaching leadership, for example, mission command and aspects of small unit leadership, you can do it either with 40 hours of PowerPoint or from my point of view, within 4 hours of playing the Kriegsspiel. Because you can stop, you can give hints, you can talk to the young people and they experience. So I really see right, but we are not doing it at the moment. We have company commanders who came to us asking, can you provide this to our company? But it's not provided in general to the whole German army. Something I really, we invented it, we are not using it.
So on that note about sort of cultivating wargaming across the force, what lessons can we draw from the Kriegsspiel and its use across the Prussian military for either the German military or even other militaries like the US and the British? And how do we incentivize the use, but also continue its cultivation across, different fields?
To be fair, you have to act like Jesus, make it a religion, and you have to find people following you. And this is what we see, and you're part of this. In Germany, we have the so-called Twitter gang, and this goes from a corporal up to colonels and generals, and they are interested in doing war games. And now we have to provide, especially together with Thorsten at the Führungsakademie, we want to provide them opportunities where they can play the game.
So we have a question. It says, have you seen the late 1930s Kriegsspiel Fibel? Is that right?
It's called Fibel, which is a small book. No, I haven't seen it. And if someone has it, I would be interested to see it. I stopped with my research about 1880, because then they had the great discussion. There's an article in 1908 who sums up everything. And then suddenly the good game is the free war game. The bad game is the rigid war game. So it's not used any longer. And I was always in the dice-based war game. And later on, it's used also in the Wehrmacht. There are articles, and I think Peter Peller has also written something about this as a common tool. But never again with so far what I've seen with the dice.
So one thing that you mentioned during the presentation was the difference between the rigid and sort of open adjudication in the Kriegsspiel. Can you go into a little bit more detail about the differences, but also the advantages and disadvantages of each?
Okay. If you play the rigid game, you have to adhere to the results of the dice. This is ground truth. And when Meckel started his criticism in 1873, he said, if I have a leader, and he refers to Prussian generals like York and others, and I would take Rommel, for example. Now, if you would play a game and it would be a free game, no dice, and you would have a dice, and you would have, and you're playing it, Rommel would tell you at a certain point in time, man, oh, Sebastian, come on, show me. I want to see you attack, 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 attack. So at a certain point in time, you are just following the idea of Rommel's, how you would call it. You are just mimicking in order to to show him that you understand what he wants from you. So 4 weeks later, you're playing with Marahrens, and Marahrens looks at you and saying, "Oh, this Sebastian guy, he's always so aggressive. Today I will show him the difference. I will show him the other way." So everything you are doing, you will always fail. The only thing you are learning on from those 2 nights, game nights, is you have to read your superior officer. But then you are well away from what's happening on the map, and therefore you can see I'm a heavy proponent of the dice-based war game. Of course, it's hard. It might be that you will lose within the first seven moves going inside the battle, and the stars or the gods of war are against you. But so is it. The next night it might be different. But not having the dice, you're always, it's velocity, it goes everything with the leader of the game. So these are advantages, disadvantages. For example, if you want to teach, of course, then it's better if you can control the situation. And this is easier if you have a free war game, because in a rigid war game, you have to see what's happening with the dice as well as a trainer. But your decision.
Yeah, those are all great points. As an educator myself and having run many educational games, I definitely understand all those challenges. There are many times in the presentation when you mentioned players, arguing against dice rolls or people having strong opinions and so forth. It's definitely a juggling act to balance your purpose of your game, whether it be a learning objective and the actual gameplay itself. So on that note, have you tried modern Kriegsspiel versions? Also, if they were to develop a postmodern Kriegsspiel, what would you change?
To be fair, I have the problem like everyone else. I'm collecting games. So I bought NATO, I bought something about the Southeast China Sea. But at the moment, I'm lacking time and people to play those games. I had the chance to work together with Thorsten on Hegemony, which I really liked. The problem with Hegemony from our perspective as the German army, we are not, or the German armed forces, we are not even one token of the game. On the other hand, it's great to teach geostrategic and strategic thinking. Therefore, I would go back, and this is my dream, would be a Kriegsspiel 2.0. And this is still a board game, a map game, maybe with augmented reality. So you can play it on one table, but the blue side can only see the blue and the red sides. And of course, automizing a little bit for example, with an iPad. Now you have the situation and you can just tick the box. Okay, blue side has 5 units, but it's standing in the forest. Or this is his problem, and red side has these advantages, and then you just push one button and you get the result. So this would be much faster. So I would go for a moderate IT support of the game leader. Everything else I would leave the way it is, and you can freeze it. Whether you take 1824 or you take 1870, 1872 as your rule set, doesn't make any difference. 1874 has the problem. Now you go to company level, and then it becomes more complex.
That's great. So I'm going to give a few more minutes just in case anyone wants to put in any last minute questions. In the meantime, I'll ask you one of our questions that we like to ask of our speakers this year, which is, if you had unlimited time, money, and support, what game would you want design or design yourself, either for education or for analysis?
To be fair, after writing 2 master theses on the Prussian Kriegsspiel, I would republish an 1872 version with tokens, maps, and dice. And I would set up extra boxes, for example, with different situation cards. For example, one on ethics, one on warfighting, one on leadership training, for example, mission command. So I would create rule sets with a certain training objective, which you then can use on a modular way in order to set up your game and use it in a unit. And that's my dream, that the German army is playing Kriegsspiel again in a modern version.
Well, if you ever build one of those copies, I will expect one of those to come to my house. I would love to use it myself. Just include some English translations for me. But it seems like we have no more questions. I will be posting this video up on YouTube later today. And if you have any questions, feel free to email myself or Soenke or the Goose Goose email at uws@georgetown.edu. And please thank our speaker for his wonderful insights and his time. Thank you, everyone.